Good morning, everyone. We'll kindly ask everyone to take their seats so we can get started. Good morning, distinguished country delegates to the dialogue, government authorities, executive of the bank, esteemed colleagues. My name is Sergio Ortiz from the Fiscal Management Division of the IDB, and I will be the MC for this event. On behalf of the organizing committee, let me please extend our appreciation for your presence here today at the Enrique Iglesias Auditorium, and for those participating virtually through our digital platforms, thank you for joining us today. Before we formally start with the dialogue, I would like to remind you that it is expected that our speakers will address the audience in different languages, and therefore there will be simultaneous interpretation in 3 of the bank's official languages: English, Spanish, and Portuguese. In this sense, for those present at the auditorium, please feel free to collect a receiver from the right side of this auditorium and ask any member of our team for assistance. For those connected through Zoom, please click the interpretation icon that you will find in the user menu and then select the language you want to listen to. Today we gather here with a shared purpose to change ideas, forge stronger partnerships, and explore innovative solutions for the challenges that we face in our region. In this sense, I will accompany you through today's sessions, conversation, and constructive debate, bringing unique perspective and experiences. And in this diversity of thought, it is that will enrich the dialogue and enable us to address complex issues from multiple angles. The regional policy dialogue constitutes one of the IDB's main mechanisms to promote the knowledge sharing between high-level government officials of Latin America and the Caribbean and key experts in development areas. The objective of these networks is to promote the dialogue between public officials that work in the sector with the aim to facilitate and exchange experiences, innovative practices, and lessons learned. Without any further ado, I would like now to proceed with the opening section, and in this regard, it will be my distinct pleasure to introduce Vice President Ana María Ibáñez. As the Vice President for Sectors and Knowledge of the Inter-American Development Bank, Ana María Ibáñez brings expertise, commitment, and 2 decades of research in development economics. Before joining the IDB, she served as Dean of the School of Economics at the Universidad de los Andes in Colombia, where she played a pivotal role in bridging academia and public policy. Her research on the long-term impacts of international displacement has influenced the design of more inclusive policies in Colombia and beyond. At the IDB, Ana Maria oversees sector strategies, knowledge generation, and technical work in areas ranging from infrastructure to climate change, education, and innovation. Her understanding of how economic growth is closely linked to critical issues such as migration, social cohesion, and conflict resolution, and therefore to dialogue, makes her a natural leader of this inaugural session. Please join me in welcoming Ana Maria Ibáñez to the stage.
Welcome to everybody. It's really a pleasure to have you all here. And welcome to the 2024 Regional Policy Dialogue, Smart Procurement for Better Public Spending in Latin America and the Caribbean. On behalf of the IDB, I want to express my gratitude to the government leaders from 17 countries, to Nobel laureate Sir Oliver Hart, who will address us in a few minutes, to colleagues, scholars, and experts who have joined us today. As everyone here knows all too well, governments must be razor-focused in ensuring every dollar, every peso, every real is invested in a way that maximizes positive results. We can't afford to waste. Our research shows that eliminating waste in government spending would free up more than 44% of the region's GDP to invest in things we need urgently: better education, better healthcare, climate adaptation, better digital infrastructure, among many other needs. We are here to explore how procurement can drive better quality spending. Good spending maximizes value. It promotes transparency. Good spending drives results aligned with the development priorities of our region. Public procurement in Latin America and the Caribbean countries account for approximately 8% of GDP and 30% of total government spending. This underscores the potential of procurement spending as a powerful policy tool, fiscal policy tool. Enhancing the quality and efficiency of public spending can also promote private sector development and boost productivity in the region. Countries in the region have made progress towards more efficient, competitive, inclusive, and transparent procurement management systems. This includes using better technological tools, procurement methods, and institutional frameworks. However, modernization processes have been uneven. Numerous inefficiencies still persist. This presents an opportunity to make public spending more efficient. By implementing more effective procurement systems, we can deliver better public services. We can achieve greater development impact. We can achieve higher economic growth, social equity, and environmental sustainability, which are the three objectives prioritized in the new IDB Impact Plus strategy. The IDB is fully committed and has been fully committed for some time to supporting the governments of the region with our tools that can advance smart public procurement. Let me give you some examples. First, the Quality of Expenditure Toolkit helps analyze procurement spending. It helps detect waste, leakages, and corruption. This toolkit has helped Guatemala, Honduras, and Paraguay identify critical factors that affect the quality of procurement expenditure. Second, we have developed a roadmap to include economic, green, and social considerations in framework agreements. This will help streamline procurement processes, thereby saving time and administrative costs. Colombia, Costa Rica, Dominican Republic, Ecuador, and Mexico City have used these roadmaps, which also support small and medium-sized enterprises with business opportunities to work with the government. We have the SAMI, Sistema de Alertas de Monitoreo de Ineficiencias, which helps identify inefficiencies in procurement contracts beyond integrity or corruption by focusing on process, performance, delays, and overruns. It is currently being tested in Peru and Bolivia. Ambitious, innovative programs and initiatives such as this help better development results, as I already mentioned. With smart public procurement, we can leverage these innovative programs to ensure public resources are spent more effectively and transparently. This will lead to improved public services, more trust in our governments, and greater development outcomes for the region. This two-day dialogue builds upon the foundation of our new institutional strategy, which we have called IDB Impact Plus strategy. It unifies and focuses the work of the IDB, IDB Invest, and IDB Lab, the three windows of the IDB group, under one goal: to ramp up the impact and scale of our results in the region. This is an instance to translate the principles of Impact Plus into actionable insights and reforms. A focus on practical measures to modernize procurement systems can ensure that public spending drives sustainable and equitable growth. This dialogue is structured around three critical pillars essential to transforming public procurement spending. First, the regulatory frameworks. Second, it's their governance. And third, digital transformation. These pillars are the foundation of a procurement system that can drive inclusive and sustainable growth, mobilize more domestic resources, and promote transparency and effectiveness. When we consider the inputs of civil society and ensure accountability at every level, we can enhance the quality of public procurement spending to benefit all sectors of society. Our shared goal is to ensure that public procurement not only addresses immediate needs, but also contributes to long-term growth and development across Latin America and the Caribbean. Based on these pillars, we aim to achieve significant public value, where procurement processes deliver tangible benefits to the community, as I mentioned: better education, better healthcare, better security, and so much more. I encourage each of you to engage actively in these discussions. This is the purpose of this regional policy dialogue, and think about how we can help shape procurement reforms and modernization as part of our fiscal agendas, with a focus on delivering real and lasting results. Together, we can draft strategies that can maximize public value and contribute to sustainable development. Now, with great pleasure, I introduce Emilio Pineda, the manager of the Institutions for Development sector, who will moderate the plenary session with Sir Oliver Hart, the 2016 Nobel laureate in economic sciences. I really look forward to the valuable insights and solutions that will emerge from our dialogue. Thank you y bienvenidos todos.
Muy buenos días tengan todos ustedes. Good morning to everybody. It's my real privilege to introduce Professor Oliver Hart, the Louis P. and Linda Geyser University Professor at Harvard University. Professor Hart was the co-recipient of the 2016 Nobel Prize in Economics for his pioneering work on ownership structures and contracts in corporate governance. His recent research focuses on designing better contracts and exploring businesses' social responsibility. He has published extensively, including the book Firms, Contracts, and Financial Structure, and his work has significantly impacted academic and legal cases. Professor Hart is a fellow of esteemed institutions such as the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the British Academy, and he was also knighted in 2023. Please join me in welcoming Professor Oliver Hart. Please, Professor.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here and to be speaking to you. I'm going to be talking about guiding principles for smart procurement spending, and it's great that I'm talking to people who are actually involved in procurement and really know something about it and will tell me whether what I'm saying is convincing or helpful. My talk is about the best way to procure goods or services. I'm going to be thinking about the case where the government is the buyer, but actually the ideas I'm talking about apply just as well to the private sector, to private buyers. I'm interested in goods and services that are somewhat complex, so not simple things like milk, where you can just use a standard contract, but I'm interested in, as I say, more complex things which take some time to complete, the goods or services, or an ongoing relationship. And, you know, some examples are construction of roads, bridges, or in the case of services, we could be talking about the operation of hospitals or prisons. And what I want to argue is that traditional contracting approaches need an update. I mean, they sometimes work, but we often hear about how they don't work, and I think one of the reasons they don't work is, well, I'll be talking about some of the reasons they don't work, and that there may be a better way of doing things. Using a formal relational contract, so I'll be getting to that. That'll be the sort of main theme of my talk. Another question that arises when the government needs something to be done, you know, it can procure it by writing a contract with a private entity, or it could do it in-house. It could have government employees actually carry out the process. For most of the talk, I will be assuming that the government has already decided not to do it in-house, but at the end I'll have a few words to say about that decision. My presentation is not specifically about Latin America or the Caribbean, because the ideas I'm talking about, I think, are general. They apply there, but they also apply to the US, Europe, and in fact, Asia, anywhere in the world, I believe. Okay, what are the problems that a buyer faces, a government, say, when it needs to procure goods or services? I think there are three main ones. Adverse selection, moral hazard, and contractual incompleteness. So adverse selection refers to the fact that the seller, the person you are contracting with, will often have more information than you do about the costs of delivering the good or service, and so you may end up paying more than you really need to. Moral hazard refers to the idea that once the contract is underway, the supplier may not put in adequate effort to deliver a high-quality product. Contractual incompleteness refers to the fact that it's really hard and often impossible to write a contract that anticipates all future events, so that things will arise during the relationship which were not foreseen when the contract was written. And that's the one that I'm going to be focusing on. So just to go over that a little more, in an ideal world, we would write a contract that would anticipate all future eventualities, and there would be contingent clauses to deal with all the different things that can happen, so that when one of those things happens, we just look at the contract and it tells us exactly what we're meant to do. But this is just impossible in any complex long-term deal. It's just too hard for the parties to anticipate and incorporate all the things that can happen during the course of their relationship. I mean, who, for example, would have anticipated the pandemic or the war in Ukraine, or for that matter, in the Middle East? You know, an ideal contract would have clauses to say how we will adjust to, how we're going to adjust to such things, but in practice, we can't do that. So, that means situations are inevitably going to arise where the initial contract does not specify clearly what is meant to happen, Or, in some cases, actually, it might specify clearly what's meant to happen, but it's no longer the right thing because of some event that we didn't anticipate. So just as a simple example, which probably will be very familiar to you, a contractor building a bridge may find that they have to drill much deeper than expected to ensure that the bridge is stable, and that might mean that some adjustment needs to be made to the type of bridge, how the bridge is going to be built. And so some renegotiation is required, and the parties may have different views about who should bear the cost, the increased cost of dealing with this situation. Now, renegotiation is certainly a way to complete contracts. So yeah, okay, you had an incomplete contract, something happened that wasn't anticipated. Now we can renegotiate. It sounds actually as if that may be a way around contractual incompleteness, but there are three things to be worried about with renegotiation. First of all, renegotiation may be an opportunity for one party to take advantage of the other party, to hold them up. Basically, I mean, think of a situation, again, I'm sure you're very familiar with this, the party who gets the contract, the supplier, gets it because they bid a very low price. So they were the lowest price bidder, they were awarded the contract. They knew actually that they were never going to be able to deliver the good, build the bridge at that price, but they anticipate that once things are underway and it's difficult for the government to switch to somebody else, the supplier can renegotiate the contract and get better terms. That's what's called a hold-up. And it may be a sufficient concern that the buyer may be very scared about getting into the contract with that party in the first place. Hold-up is definitely one problem. It's not the only problem. A second problem is, even if we're not extremely opportunistic, neither of us is, it still may be quite difficult to reach agreement about how to adjust to the new situation, how to adjust to the fact that we need to change the specifications of the bridge because it's not going to be stable. So there can be a lot of argument about that, and it takes time and resources to resolve that argument. Renegotiation is costly. There's a third problem, which I think has received much less attention, which is that, but is very important, which is that even if we overcome these contracting costs and we reach agreement, it may be that the agreement is something that one of us at least, maybe both of us, but certainly one of us, doesn't feel was very fair. And so, yes, you agreed to some new terms, but you don't think you got the terms you deserved, and so that leaves some bad feeling, what I've called in some of my work aggrievement, and the consequence of that is that so actually this was some work, joint work with John Moore. We published in 2008 an article called Contracts as Reference Points, and what we argued is that if a party doesn't get a fair deal, they're going to shade on performance going forward. So examples of shading, they could slow down the work, cut corners, use the C team on the project instead of the A team, and they can be aggressive going forward about what the contract includes or excludes. So the reason why are they doing this? They're doing this basically because they take the view, the other party didn't treat me fairly in this renegotiation, and so why should I treat them fairly going forward? Why should I be cooperative? It may also, so partly it's just a punishment, but partly it may also be to recoup some of the losses that you feel you didn't get a fair deal, so now you're going to improve your situation because some of these things I just described are going to reduce your costs going forward. So this can sour the relationship, okay? And and just mean that, yes, we renegotiated the contract, we managed to achieve an agreed-on outcome, but the cost is that going forward the relationship is soured and it's just not going to proceed so well. Okay, so these are the kinds of problems caused by contractual incompleteness. Now, what's the traditional approach for dealing with these problems? Well, it's to minimize them by specifying as much as possible in as much as possible in the initial contract. In other words, we take the view, let's try to make the contract as complete as possible so that the gaps are very unlikely to be important. But this is a strategy which I think is, in most cases, designed to fail. It's going to fail because however much time you spend trying to think of all the things that can happen, there's still going to be a lot of things you can't think of. And so, in a way, it's sort of a bit pointless. And indeed, it may even be counterproductive because the more, sometimes if you put more stuff into a contract, then when something happens that wasn't in the contract, it makes it harder to resolve that thing, just because you put so many other things in. Okay, let me give an example. I think it's always useful to have concrete examples. So this is an example of incomplete contracting in practice. It involves the state of Indiana and IBM. So during his first term, Governor Mitch Daniels announced that Indiana's welfare system was broken and plagued by high error rates, fraud, wasted dollars, poor conditions for its employees, and very poor service to its clients. In late December 2006, the state and IBM entered into a 10-year, $1.3 billion master services agreement, MSA, in an effort to modernize and improve Indiana's welfare eligibility system. So this is a quote: "The MSA intended to establish centralized service and call centers for the processing of welfare applications, enable remote electronic access to the system, provide the state a paperless document system, create systems to combat fraud, and improve Indiana's poor welfare-to-work record, and lower administrative costs." So this was called modernization. IBM began to roll out the modernized version in a pilot, as a sort of in a pilot, and the parties immediately saw some problems, but in spite of these, the state approved rolling out the project to additional counties in Indiana. But, there were already problems at that stage. Then various disasters occurred. First, Indiana was faced with the Great Recession, and the state unemployment rate more than doubled. And because of this, benefit applications increased dramatically, which put the system under stress. And then, on top of that, Indiana was hit with a series of natural disasters beginning in 2008, which also meant that benefit applications increased, and again, more stress on the system. And the whole thing, worked very badly. And in October 2009, Secretary Murphy notified IBM that the state was terminating the MSA for cause effective December. And the state then sued IBM for breach, and there was extensive and extended litigation with the court's ruling, I think first for IBM, but then later for the state. And at the end of it all, the state collected significant damages from IBM. Okay, so why do I talk about this example? Well, partly because it may resonate with you, but also partly because I think it shows that even a sophisticated player, because who would say that IBM, I mean, maybe the state of Indiana is, I don't know how sophisticated they are. One would hope they are, but who knows. But IBM, we surely think, oh, it's been around for a long time. It's a very well-established and well-regarded company with surely great access to great lawyers and all that sort of thing. So we think of them as a sophisticated player, and yet they got into this situation. They didn't write a contingent contract. They didn't anticipate these natural disasters and have clauses to deal with them. You know, if there was going to be big overload, they didn't. And that suggests this is a, you know, this is a kind of endemic problem. Okay, is there another way? So, you know, if you can't write a complete contract or anything close to that, even if you're a sophisticated player like IBM, is there another way? And I want to, now we come to the main theme of my talk, which is to argue, yes, there is another way, which is to use a formal relational contract. Okay. To explain what that is, let's start off with the idea of a relational contract. So it's been recognized for a very long time that what's written in the contract is not the only important thing. The relationship between the parties matters too. This was argued a long time ago by Macaulay, then more recently by McNeill. And then, of course, there's a massive repeated game literature in game theory. In the last few years, I've been working with two practitioners, David Friedlinger, who's a lawyer in Sweden, and Kate Vitasek, who's an academic at the University of Tennessee. She works on supply chain management. We've been working together on how to design, on this idea of a formal relational contract. And the basic thing about this, which is different from the prior literature, is that in the prior literature, so if you look at, say, McNeill's writings, I think it's fair to say that the relationship and the contract are rather separate things. In our work, we combine them. The two things are interlinked. And so the whole idea is to design the contract and the relationship at the same time and embody them both in this formal relational contract. If you want to learn more about it, you could start with a 2019 article that we wrote that was published in Harvard Business Review, but there are also other things. There's a book, which I was not an author of, but the other two were, plus some other people. I can, anybody who's interested, I can provide you further references. Okay, so what's the idea of a formal relational contract? The idea is, first of all, it's going to contain many components of a traditional contract, price and lots of other things like that, but it's also going to contain relationship building elements, such as a shared vision, guiding principles, and robust governance structures to keep the parties' interests and expectations aligned. So the most fundamental idea here is that we want to avoid, this is where it ties in with my theoretical work with Moore, we want to avoid aggrievement and shading. We want to avoid a situation when one party feels they're not getting a fair deal. This is not at the beginning of the contract, but during the, when we have to revise the contract, or maybe when a revision is called for, one of us thinks, but the other one doesn't and wants to stick to the contract as is, even though some, quote, unforeseen event has occurred. So we don't want parties to feel aggrieved, because we know that if they're aggrieved, they're going to cut back on cooperation going forward, and that's going to mean a less productive relationship. So the whole point is to try to keep the parties' interests and expectations aligned so that we're on the same page throughout the relationship. Okay, organizations adopting the approach use a structured step-by-step process in which they sit in face-to-face meetings and jointly create the deal and contract one step at a time. The process starts by the parties adopting a shared vision for their relationship. Now, this actually, I want to just emphasize this. In a way, it sounds may sound obvious, but the idea here is it really fits very well with the way economists think about contracts. I mean, people write contracts because there's some value to be created, right? We're doing it because we can collectively achieve more than if we go our separate ways. And then it's just a matter of how we divide this value or surplus up between us. So it's what game theorists would call a positive sum game. It's not a zero-sum game. If it was a zero-sum game, we shouldn't bother at all. We should just walk away. But although this is in a way completely obvious, I think it's not the traditional approach, because the traditional approach is each side hires gets their lawyers to think of all the ways that the other side can take advantage of them and tries to guard against that. It's a zero-sum mentality as opposed to the positive sum mentality that is embodied in this approach. Okay, so both parties must also make a conscious effort to create an environment of trust, one in which they are transparent about their high-level aspirations, specific goals, and concerns. So we talk about what each of us is trying to achieve out of this relationship. The parties also commit to 6 guiding principles. These are very important: loyalty, equity, honesty, integrity, autonomy, and reciprocity. And these guiding principles serve many functions. They will steer the parties throughout the rest of the process. So we're still doing the contracting, right? But also, just as important, or even perhaps even more important, they provide a framework for resolving potential misalignments when uncontracted for circumstances occur. So that the idea is that when something unanticipated occurs, 3 years after we started, and we consult the contract, it doesn't say what's meant to happen, we now use these guiding principles to help us to resolve this in a way that both of us feel comfortable with, and we're not going to be aggrieved, we're not going to shade. Having set the foundations for the relationship, the parties hammer out the terms of the deal. So as I say, we've agreed on the guiding principles, and then we hammer out the terms, responsibilities, metrics, pricing. It's crucial that all terms and conditions of the formal relational contract are aligned with the guiding principles. As a final step, we agree on structures and processes to govern the relationship over time, involving well-defined communication processes to ensure continuous alignment of interests and expectations. So let me also emphasize that. Communication is extremely important in this. We agree to communicate constantly, I mean, not continuously, but very frequently. So in particular, if I see some problem coming up, I don't wait until the last minute to tell you about it. I tell you about it ahead of time because I've agreed to do that. All the components, from vision and guiding principles to the pricing model and the communication processes, are documented in the written and enforceable contract, together with things like limitations of liability, indemnification, confidentiality, etc., etc. Okay, this may sound like pie in the sky, but no, it's actually used in practice. My colleagues have used it. David Friedlinger is, as I said, a practicing lawyer. He uses it with his clients on a day-to-day basis. And some major entities have used this approach. The Canadian government has, Dell, Intel, AstraZeneca, and the Swedish telecom firm Telia, as well as many smaller organizations. Okay, this is not a panacea. It's not something that everybody should be using, because so for some simple, let's go back to simple things, procuring milk, say, I don't need this elaborate construct, which is obviously going to take time. You know, we spend time talking to each other to set up this formal relational contract. It's not costless. So in you know, quite a few cases, a standard transactional contract is going to be adequate. A second thing, but for complex deals, this can really be, I think, superior. A second thing is that you have to make sure that the other party is willing to engage in this process. So not all sellers or buyers are set up or have a corporate culture which is consistent with agreeing to guiding principles and going through all this process. So, you know, you're going to have to eliminate, if you want to use this approach, you have to find a good match. At the same time, although it's not to be used always, I think that formal relational contracts can be useful in many different countries. So people often say, oh, you know, this is fine, it works in the US or in Sweden or somewhere like that, but would it work in less developed countries? I think my co-authors think, yes, it can work there, because the 6 guiding principles, which are absolutely fundamental, they are social norms that exist everywhere. So, you know, it doesn't matter where you live in the world, loyalty, equity, honesty, integrity, these kinds of things are things we're all familiar with. And so when we agree to follow them and put them into the formal contract, the formal relational contract, it's more of a matter of them being activated than being chosen. They're not foreign things, they are familiar things. I think they may be particularly helpful in situations where corruption is a problem, because if you can get a serious agreement to follow principles of honesty and integrity, maybe accompanied by an open book policy, then you can mitigate corruption. I should say that these guiding principles are not just agreed to and then put in a drawer. We talk about what they mean when we write the formal relational contract, and then we refer to them. So in one of the cases I'm familiar with involving the Canadian government and some healthcare providers, these guiding principles were brought out at every meeting to remind people what they'd agreed to. In other words, to reactivate them. Okay, so let me just say a few words. I don't know, how am I doing for time? Yeah, okay, I'm pretty near the end. So just want to say briefly, I said I would return to this, the possibility of doing things in-house as opposed to with an outside contractor. This is actually something I considered in an earlier paper with Andrei Schleifer and Robert Vishny, published in 1997, The Proper Scope of Government. And, you know, we considered a whole range of government of services that the government needed, starting with things like the armed forces, or, you know, nuclear weapons. Should the government own nuclear weapons, or should they contract with a private provider to use them? Okay, didn't seem like a good idea, but we wanted to know why, and we argued in cases like that that going back to the hold-up problem, that would just be too great, that, you know, whoever has these things could just hold up the government for huge amounts of money in order to allow these things to be used if they're not in the government's hands. There are, okay, going to less extreme cases, and we also said we couldn't imagine the government outsourcing foreign policy. But as I say, going to less extreme cases, we argued that there are some things where contracting with a for-profit entity could lead to problems, because the for-profit entity would have a strong incentive to be efficient, which is a good thing, but might have an incentive to produce lower quality because it's so focused on profit. And we argued that maximum security prisons were an example of something where the efficiency gains from outsourcing were probably outweighed by quality issues. A private provider hiring inferior guards who would perhaps either not be able to deal with violence or would be too violent themselves. And another example is ambulance services. There's an interesting paper by Knudsen and Tirefors who showed that, this was in Stockholm, I think, that privately provided ambulance services were better than government ones in terms of response times, but worse in terms of the mortality of the patients they took to hospitals. At the same time, this earlier work of mine with Schleifer and Vishny, and also this, well, Knudsen and Tirefors argue, well, maybe you could, instead of doing it in-house, you could have the government contracting with a non-profit, a not-for-profit. So dull the high-power profit incentives that way by not dealing with a for-profit, but rather a not-for-profit. Another possibility is to have a cost-plus contracting arrangement. These are things that were not considered in the 1997 paper, were not considered very seriously. So I think more work, we still don't understand well enough the boundaries between public and private ownership. Another thing we didn't consider in the earlier paper was a formal relational contract between, the government and maybe a provider of someone dealing with maximum security prisons. I mean, you could try a formal relational contract. Anyway, we didn't do that because I hadn't thought of it, or I hadn't found my practitioner friends who were doing it. So this was, I hadn't done the contracts as reference points or any of that. So anyway, I think this is still a bit of a question mark over this whole insourcing versus outsourcing decision. Okay, I think I've gone on enough. So let me just summarize. The traditional approach to procurement contracting is to include as much detail in the contract as possible. The result is a contract that is hundreds of pages long that probably neither side understands. I heard at breakfast that, probably in the US it's several hundred pages long, and in Latin American countries it may be, twice or three times that. So this seems, this is the traditional approach. I think it often doesn't work well. I've suggested that a better approach is to put less detail in the contract, accept that it's going to be incomplete, and set up procedures that the parties agree to use to resolve the incompleteness, if and when it occurs. And most important of these guiding principles, which, as I say, I think are things that people can follow everywhere because they are actually familiar social norms. Let me just end by saying that, I would like to argue that this approach works in practice because my practitioner friends find that it does so, but it also works in theory in the sense that there's a theoretical foundation for it based on this work I did with John Moore. So given this irresistible combination, and this may be a little hyperbolic, but I would say, the irresistible combination of theory and practice, I invite you to take the challenge and try the new approach to improve not only contractual outcomes, but also, with luck, the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Hart. An excellent presentation. I think your key messages speak closely to the daily experience of the policymakers that are here with us. All of us experience on a daily basis that the traditional approach of procurement has a lot of issues, a lot of problems. Whether we knew it was called incompleteness of contracts or not is not really the most important thing. We knew that we ran into a lot of issues with unforeseen events that contracts were not able to deal with effectively. So in this context is that I think your proposal, your idea of having an alternative way of dealing with the incompleteness of contracts is very, very interesting and compelling, especially for our region. And I think it's the challenge that you leave to us is excellent. It's an excellent challenge that we'd like to present to the policymakers in this type of event. So thank you very much, Professor Hart. And now we'll start with a dialogue with the colleagues here. But let me kickstart the dialogue before giving the floor to the people in the audience with a question that you kind of already addressed in your presentation that I would like to elaborate a little bit more. One of the concerns that we will hear when we try to push these formal relational contracts in the region is whether Latin America and the Caribbean, due to its big concern with corruption and the lack of institutional capabilities, is really ready to take on this approach. So the fact that in the region we have weaknesses in audit capabilities, that we have a long-standing concern by governments and the population that procurement is typically not used in a proper fashion, whether right or wrong. Would that make it more amenable for the use of relational contracts or less amenable?
Well, that's a good question. In a way, you've sort of answered it by saying, is it more or less? I'm not sure which way it goes, because I think the kind of institutional capacity you're talking about may also, if it's not there, it can be difficult to write good standard contracts, because you need to be very if you're going to try to think of all the things that can go wrong, you have to be quite capable, right? And if you're not capable, you may end up writing a contract which is very favorable to the seller just because you didn't think of a whole bunch of things. And from that point of view, these principles, they're much easier to think about, and they are a way to cover the very things you can't think about. So I think it may actually argue for this approach.
Perfect. I think it makes a lot of sense. It's not that the institutional capabilities are not having an impact already in the traditional standard contracts, and there's no clear ex-ante reason why the formal relational contracts might have higher requirements institutional capability-wise. I think that makes a lot of sense. And I know, Professor, that you have a strong interest in listening from the practitioners in the audience. Mm-hmm. So let's open the floor for dialogue. So I would ask the colleagues and public officials that would like to start this dialogue. There's a microphone, so raise your hand. I see there Carola. And if it's okay with you, Professor, we can gather 3 questions.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so let's start with Carola.
I can remember them.
Hi, Professor Hart. Your theory of incomplete contracts provides valuable insights into the challenges of designing optimal agreements. And these insights, as you mentioned, and Emilio just mentioned, are very important for Latin America public procurement. We have greater uncertainty, so many contracts tend to be very incomplete, but we also have rampant corruption, sometimes passive, but mostly active. You also did important work with Sandy Grossman on these issues, on moral hazard and incompleteness. By the way, we are also champions in renegotiations of PPP contracts. About 75 of them are renegotiated in our region in the first few years. So apart from uncertainty, we have a lot of corruption, as you also mentioned, and Emilio mentioned. So our government differs from the benevolent government model. How can your theory be adapted to address these complexities of government agencies that may be influenced by self-interest or corruption? In this thing about also another item is that, don't you think that opportunistic government agents can overdo incomplete contracts? So with renegotiation, they can avoid auctions and hold out or shadow, as you say in your papers, So in this case, the buyer or the government is who gains with renegotiations with opportunistic officials. And I think there is some evidence in our region on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Carola. We collect 2 more questions, Professor, if that's okay with you.
Thank you very much, Professor, for the presentation. It was very interesting. The idea of relation contracts seems to be very different from what officials and the regulations says in Latin America, but it seems like a good idea to pursue. To be able to implement that, countries should probably have to do a lot of institutional changes to the current laws and regulation, and also invest in capacities of the procurement officials. So if you were to implement that in a country and you have to recommend some institutional changes, what do you think that they will be the most important ones in order to be able to implement this type of contracts, given there is a lot of flexibility in the negotiation that is not typical what happened in the region, and we have to give that amplitude to officials to negotiate? And what do you think are the typical capacities that a procurement officer don't have right now, and they should invest in order to introduce this type of contracting?
Thank you, Alejandro. We have one here.
Gracias, buenos días.
You have for translation. Do you understand Spanish?
I'm going to speak in Spanish. Testing 1 2 3. Testing. Testing 1 2 3. Can you hear me okay? Testing 1 2 3. Testing. Thank you, Professor. Jorge Luis Garcia from Guatemala. Given that what you just discussed contractually, governments have the advantage when there's any sort of litigation to maintain that litigation because of the government apparatus as well as the use of resources that they can rely on. Nevertheless, contractors have the advantage that they can get better capacities for mitigating than governments. Frequently, the governments are not as specialized in this type of contract litigation. So what would you recommend in order to introduce all of these values that you just described, especially given that those impacted in contractual litigation are really the citizens, when they'll have to wait until that litigation is finally settled before they can actually access the goods and services that are expected from that contract? Thank you.
Okay, well, these are all interesting questions, and not sure how good my answers are going to be. I mean, the first question, I think, was focusing again on corruption, and you know, that's a serious problem. I know that's a serious problem. It comes back to really my answer to you, which is corruption is a problem. Whatever contract, whatever type of contract you write, I mean, if you use a more transactional approach, there are all sorts of ways that things can go wrong. And you know, one example is you award. I mean, you try to have a transparent process where the low price bidder, you know, it's an auction for building a highway or something, and the low price bidder wins the auction, and then you know, halfway through says, I can't complete it under these terms. I'm losing money and I'm going to go bankrupt, and you're going to have to you know, give me much more, and it's going to take much longer. And if you have a corrupt official there, that maybe they'll do that even if it's, you know, they'll agree to that even if it's not really the case, because they're bribed or something. So, you know, I think what looks like a transparent process may end up backfiring, not working, and I'm not sure why what I'm suggesting is going to perform any less well with corrupt officials than the standard process. But I think part of what I'm recommending is, because it is a trust building exercise, that's part of it, and also you've agreed to these guiding principles of, among other things, honesty and integrity and transparency. That's another important part of it. That, you know, I sort of take the view that if you can find people who are serious about these things and who agree to them, this is something they are going to be inclined to stick to. So actually they're going to end up being less corrupt. So maybe that's naive, but I think that would be my view. So I don't see this corruption as making this not impossible by any means. It may actually help with corruption. The second question, I think, was about capacity, if I'm remembering right, and whether what you would have to do. This is very far from what we see now. So how would you move to a situation where this kind of approach could be adopted? That's undoubtedly challenging, but I'm not sure that, you know, because the ideas behind this approach are very simple, I'm not sure that you really need a huge amount of training to get people to do it. I think what you need is a change of attitude, which in principle, you know, is possible. In fact, the cases I'm familiar with where this approach has been used are ones, it's just a subset of all the cases, but it just happens to be the ones I'm familiar with. They are ones where the parties started with a traditional approach, and then it went wrong. And their relationship was very bad, but neither of them could walk away because they were locked into each other. You know, classic situation. The cost of actually exiting and finding another partner midway through the relationship is very great for both parties. So they need to resolve it, but they were, you know, the relationship was in terrible shape, and so they couldn't. And then they discovered this approach, and they switched to it. So you could say, how can the very same people who not only, you know, had adopted a standard approach to begin with, but were now angry with each other, how could they now move to an approach based on trust and all this sort of stuff? But the answer is, it's precisely because things had gone wrong that they were able to do it, and things worked so much better going forward. So I can describe, you know, if anybody's interested, I can describe one of these cases. But yeah, so that makes me think that it is possible without. The main thing is a change of attitude. The question about litigation, well, I'm sure what you say is right, but I guess the whole point of this approach is to avoid litigation. This is the last thing we want. These contracts are formal, and you know, one of the questions I often get is why does it really make sense to have these guiding principles be part of the formal contract? Because could you actually litigate? You know, if I wasn't equitable to you, or I wasn't loyal to you, could you sue me for breach of contract? It's part of the formal contract. My co-authors, the practitioners, think that yes, you could. For me, that's a less important part of it. I think that it may be self-enforcing. It may be enough that we agree to these things and that you know, we refer to them frequently, and then I'm going to be equitable and loyal because I said I was going to be, even though you can't successfully sue me for breach of contract. But my co-authors think that actually litigation is possible, and indeed it is the case that, you know, good faith is a concept in US law, contract law, that contracting parties owe each other a duty of good faith. And that's something that can be litigated, even though it sounds rather vague. What does good faith mean, really? Well, if you can litigate that, maybe you can litigate these other things. But, sorry, this is a little roundabout. I think my point is that litigation is the last thing we want. We're trying to avoid it using this approach.
Thank you, Professor. I think we have time for a couple of more questions. So I have, you have generated like 5 different questions. So por favor sean breves en la.
Please, let's be brief in our questions so that we can include more questions. Maybe you could. Amparo Zuleta.
University in Bogotá. You just mentioned the good faith. So I was wondering to what extent the idea of the relational contract is an interpretation, a new interpretation of the good faith that in the case of Latin law and, Roman law is involved in any contract. And if we discuss a little bit of good faith, all the principles that you mentioned are involved in good faith. So I was thinking that the issue is that when an unforeseeable event happens, what you have is that the interests of the parties are not longer aligned. And then we have the issue, and it's difficult in this moment to say, hey, remember the good faith principle. And in addition, we are talking about public sector and politics, and of course the normal discussion between policy and politics. And sometimes the public interests play an important role, and the public party may say, I cannot continue in the same way because public interests of whatever is going on with the political party and the presidency and all the guys in power make an important role, and it's really difficult to try to say this is good faith and this is the way in which you should act. So it was more a reflection and a concern, because I don't know to which extent we are talking about good faith.
Thank you. Now we go here, please.
Yeah. Hello.
Is it working? Yeah.
Me?
This is not mine. I got it from, this is a Zoom. Sorry? Okay, sorry about that. And then this is from the sanctions officer of the IDB. And he's asking, how does this type of contracting would affect the bidding process, the method of selection? Oliver, I think this is the sanction officer, and bidding documents as well. So his question is regarding those two, bidding process and bidding documents, how this type of contracting would change that.
Thank you. And here, please.
Okay, I'm from Korea. My name is Sang Nam. I'm very interested in your idea. I want to raise not issue, some concern about the how to implement your idea into the government budget. Actually, when it comes to government budget, the budget is already decided in the previous year. So by the a certain budget amount, it will be executed in the procurement later. So when we implement this kind of a new concept, it will change the process of the budget, something like that. So I know that you have an example of the Canadian government. That's they also have a budget system, so they already they prepare the budget in the previous fiscal year, and by the allotted budget they executed the budget in the procurement process. So when it comes to the new idea into the procurement of the government, how this will affect the budget system? Something has been already fixed in the first place, right? So I don't know how to use this concept into the fixed government budget system into procurement contractual changes. That's my the questions.
Okay. So I think the first question, Were you being supportive? I couldn't quite. The good faith. Are you saying that good faith, in which case I like the question, but are you saying that good faith is, that what I'm talking about is sort of similar to good faith? And I mean, but I think it's much more elaborate. And I think good faith means something, but it doesn't mean as much as these guiding principles. These guiding principles really spell things out much more. You could say, yeah, this is what perhaps good faith should mean, but it's not usually spelled out. And so, for example, when we take the IBM case, there's suddenly overload because of the Great Recession. IBM goes to the state of Indiana and says, look, we didn't anticipate this, and we can't deal with it, and we need some help from you. Indiana says, don't be ridiculous, you're a sophisticated entity. The fact that you didn't say anything about this in the contract means that you have to bear the risk of this. It's your problem. Now, does good faith really? I don't think good faith is going to tell us about. I don't think a judge is going to say one of you is right, one of you is wrong because of good faith. Whereas I think with the guiding principles, it's going much further. I think the guiding principles, my interpretation of them, is that we've agreed to look at it from the other person's point of view. In other words, I've agreed, I'm going to think about putting myself in your position and how would I look at it, and you do the same for me, and that allows us to come up with some compromise which both of us find acceptable. It may sound, crazily optimistic, but it works. That's the practical. That's what the practitioners find. It actually works. So I think it's going beyond that, but it's in the same spirit. I think the second question was about the auction process, and this is important, and I probably should have had a slide on it, but I didn't, which is that I think with the guiding principles, if you're going to adopt this approach, you need to find parties who are willing to do it. So it's no good, and as I did describe this, that you agree on the guiding principles before you agree on the price. So you can't. That sort of goes against an auction process where you've already decided to award it, to somebody based on their price bid. It's no good then to say, let's start talking about, well, you could go with it. But the thing is, they might not be the right kind of party. They might not have the corporate culture that works, that for which guiding principles are consistent. So I think what my practitioner friends do is they have a process. It's not that they give up on competition altogether, but what they do is they would have a small number of bidders who they've already screened as being people who they are willing to embrace the guiding principles. And then they would discuss price with them. It wouldn't be an auction, but it would be a sort of process by which the parties are willing to offer prices, and then you can decide maybe to go with the lowest bidder then, because they're all, the two bidders that you're talking to are both willing to adopt the guiding principles, or maybe you might decide not to do that because you think one of them is better on some other dimension. But so there is a sort of competitive process, but it's not a full scale auction. The question about Korea, I'm not sure I fully understood it. Was it that previous governments have put in, that there were already contracts of another kind, and now the question is how to modify them, or was it, I'm not 100%
it's
sure.
like in the government budget system, it's already fixed. So in case of the changes in the prices, or in case of the changes of the contracts, it will affect the government budgeting system somehow. So I don't know how to implement the flexibility of the changes of the contract into the government budgeting system. So You know what I'm asking?
No, I'm not sure. Do you understand?
I think he's referring on the relationship between the procurement and the budget system. So whether the flexibility that these formal relational contracts would entail, how would that flexibility could interact with a budget system that is already fixed, a budget, an annual budget, if I understood well.
Right, that's correct.
So you mean you've already decided how much to spend on this highway, and then that means that the procurement officer doesn't have the flexibility to raise the price if some unforeseen event occurs?
Yeah, so in a formal relational contract, we would assume that once you encounter a problem, that might involve that the government would pay additional money for the additional problem.
Yes.
So how would that flexibility interact with the rigidity of the budget?
Well, I guess I'd like to know how well that system works. What happens if the contractor announces they can't finish the highway? And now what the government says, well, we don't have any money, so we certainly can't offer you more. That could be I mean, some people would say, oh, that's a great way of doing things because that's a hard budget constraint. It's a commitment device. Don't ever think you can come back and renegotiate for more. You were a low bidder. You took the view that you can always get more later. But no, that's not true because we don't have any money. I mean, that's rather antithetical to what I'm talking about. And I question whether it's really a good way of doing things. I think having some flexibility in general, there can be some costs of it, but as I say, if what's going to happen is that sometimes the contractor is actually going to really be unable to finish the road, then, what do? You're in trouble. So it seemed that raises a whole other set of questions, which I think would be true, going to, they're questions for the traditional approach as well.
Thank you, Professor. We're running out of time, so I will gather only one more question, please. I have 3 more questions, so that's do I need to be flexible in a relational way with the colleagues here, or?
Yes, that's true.
So let's gather the 3 questions, but please be very concise and brief. Okay, so let's start here, then Gerardo, and then I see a lady in the back, please. We don't have a Nobel laureate.
So hard. Thank you very much. I'm going to be as concise as possible. John Luigi Albano from Italian government, centralized procurement organization. It is one of the most frustrating experiences for a public procurement practitioner or also half-time academic as I am, is to join conferences in which people discuss the idea of awarding a fair share of public contracts to SMEs. And the reason why it's frustrating is because if you go around the table, there are at least 150 different definitions of fairness when it comes to deciding which share is fair. So this goes back to your question. The concept of fairness, of trust, typically in economic theory, is the outcome of something. We play a repeated game, we trust each other because there is a threat that at some point you might punish me more than I can punish you. But so this is by putting those principles and pillars as a sort of a starting principle, overarching principles, you still need a way of translating them into, sort of implementing them, to use a more economic, into clauses. What is the way we're going to use, say, fairness when it comes to unforeseen contingencies? Like the story about IBM in Indiana sort of makes me smile a little bit because, in the cloud services-driven world, this would have been handled very simply with scalability. I mean, this is a very simple problem. In PPP concessions, the equivalent that would be there's a sudden drop in demand for a highway. So we know how to deal with that. So it's very amazing that they terminated the contract. So my question is, pointing and writing and agreed on the principle, like agreeing on a constitution, this is like a constitution among the parties, would that be enough to get to the implementation stage? When it comes the unforeseen, event, are we able automatically to derive, what to do? I mean, I don't want to sound too pessimistic about this, but I need to be, because if I want to take this back to Italy, I have to be convincing. Thank you.
Thank you. So 2 more questions. Please be very brief in your question, please.
Professor, thank you very much for an excellent 360 things, topic about procurement. My question relates to, there was an article in The Economist 2 days ago about governments being bigger ever and more useless than ever as well. So this thing about too big to fail also applies to the government. In that sense, what you discuss now is actually goes at the heart of the main problem in the procurement, which is providing public services in an efficient and timely manner. In that sense, what I understood from your presentation is you try to establish effectiveness through this formal relation contract. The question is about effectiveness and how to actually evaluate the outcome of those contracts vis-a-vis what was the traditional contract we have been operating with over so many centuries. And also this new idea that we need to be faster, we need to be more effective, and we need to be more flexible. So in those views, what is your suggestion in terms of, first, governments being bigger than ever and useless than ever, with this idea that this could work?
Thank you. And the last question here is going to be, this question is going to be in Spanish, Professor. So if you want to...
Sí, voy a hablar en español.
¿Va a hablar en español?
Sí.
I'm going to speak in Spanish. Well, more than a question, I would just like to offer a comment. First of all, the contracts and procurements have 3 major phases. First, you have the pre-contract phase, then you have the contract, and then the post procurement phase, because in my country, the Dominican Republic, and in other countries in the region, that the procurement systems have focused on the post-procurement phase, which is the key fundamental point that the professors referred to. So changes in contract happen because of different causes, because of unforeseen circumstances, which means that they need to be subject to regulatory practices. There needs to be mechanisms, not based on just going to the jurisdictional phase, because then when we get into litigation, the losers are the public, the providers, the contractors. So we need to look at other methods for settlements that will reduce expenditures of resources as well as waste of time. So we need to look at standard contracts with governments so that we can reduce a lot of the contracting from private sectors. And contracts, standard contracts, need to include specific clauses. In other words, unilateral withdrawal from a contract so that the government can protect the collective society's interests. I think your comments have been very enlightening, and I'm going to take away a lot of key things. So the standard contracts are something that's absent. We're always looking at judgments and lawsuits, but who follows up the contracts? Who provides the guarantees? Who can ensure that the goods and services are going to be provided subject to the conditions and the quality and effectiveness that was already envisioned in the contracts? Thank you very much, Professor, for your presentation.
Okay, well, let me try some answers. I think okay, so the first question, there was some skepticism, I think, about the approach. Oh God, now I'm forgetting. It was, I mean, you said that you thought the IBM, oh, I think what you said, okay. Yes, I think the point is that you're skeptical about how these principles are actually going to resolve problems in practice. And I think my response, if I was sitting where you're sitting and listening to me, I might feel the same thing. But since we're going to apply guiding principles, you have to put yourself in my position. No, the thing is that I would have felt the same thing as you before I teamed up with the practitioners. So, you know, as a theorist, as an economic theorist, if somebody has told me, you know, just agreeing to a principle, to these 6 principles is actually going to seriously change behavior and going to lead to a relationship that really works, I would have been very skeptical, right? But then I meet these practitioners who tell me we do this and it works. And so, you know, I take that very seriously. By the way, I do want to say, this is kind of important. This is very different from the repeated game ideas, which have, you know, everyone's familiar with, which is I'm nice to you today because if I'm not, you won't be nice to me tomorrow. I think this is about, first of all, some of these are finite relationships. They end. And so you know, at some point there won't be a tomorrow, but we still have agreed on these principles in advance. But the second thing is, I think if you think of some unforeseen event happening where we have to adjust the contract and the question is who's going to bear the cost, I'm not sure repeated game ideas are terribly useful for those sorts of things. It's much more for because there isn't going to be another one like that. Quite possibly, there's never going to be another adjustment like that. So what we need is something that we've already agreed to resolve this. And the reason it works is because we agreed to it. It's not because we're looking ahead to the future. Well, we want to make sure the relationship remains healthy, but it's because of something promises we actually already made. So it's a different approach. But I think the proof is in the pudding. You have to see whether it works in practice. And my claim is, or at least based on what my co-authors are telling me, is it does. And it may be sort of a bit magical that it does, but it does. Now, I think to the second question, which I think was about how do we measure whether these things work? Well, we look at outcomes. And that's possible. And I think actually going forward, what I would love to see is a randomized control trial. And this is one way to see whether it works. Let's have some people using this and some people not using it, and let's see which ones work better. I mean, that's the sort of gold standard now. Even, you know, it has been in medicine for a long time, but it is now in economics. And I think that would be the way forward. And we can, you know, we need more evidence. But the evidence so far is, I think, is encouraging. And I think the third, I will just say that was a helpful comment. I'm going to take it as a comment.
Well, thank you very much, Professor. I think it has been a fascinating conversation. I think you leave us with a lot of ideas, with challenging proposals that now is our work, our job, the job of the practitioners to go through them and to start trying to implement them and look at their feasibility. But thank you very much. It's really been a privilege to have you here. It has been a fascinating dialogue. And I would ask everybody to join me in thanking the professor.
Thank you, Emilio.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sir Oliver. Thank you very much, Emilio. We would like to invite you to please go to the foyer where there's a coffee break, and we will get back here in 10 minutes. Thank you very much.